Inflation, a term that surfaces regularly in economic discussions and news headlines, has profound effects on the everyday lives of people across the globe. When inflation rises, it erodes purchasing power, making goods and services more expensive over time. The phenomenon of rising prices is not merely a result of a single factor, but is instead the outcome of a complex interplay of various economic forces. Understanding what causes inflation is crucial not only for policymakers and economists, but also for households and businesses seeking to navigate uncertain economic waters. Delving into the roots of inflation reveals a tapestry of influences, ranging from macroeconomic policies to global supply chain disruptions, that collectively drive the price hikes witnessed in markets. At its core, inflation is defined as the sustained increase in the general price level of goods and services in an economy over a period of time. It is typically measured by indices such as the Consumer Price Index, CPI, or the Producer Price Index, PPI, which track changes in the cost of a basket of goods and services. A moderate level of inflation is often seen as a sign of a growing economy, encouraging consumption and investment. However, when inflation accelerates beyond manageable levels, it can destabilize economies, erode savings, and lead to social unrest. The causes of inflation are multifaceted, and economists generally categorize them into two broad types: demand pull and cost push inflation. Additionally, structural factors, monetary policies, expectations, and external shocks can all play significant roles in fueling inflationary pressures. Demand pull inflation occurs when aggregate demand in an economy outpaces aggregate supply. In simple terms, when consumers, businesses, and the government collectively spend more than what the economy can produce, prices are pushed upward. This scenario often unfolds during periods of robust economic growth, low unemployment, and rising incomes, which boost consumer confidence and spending. For example, after a recession, when governments implement stimulus measures to jumpstart the economy, the influx of money can lead to increased demand for goods and services. If producers are unable to ramp up production quickly enough to meet this heightened demand, shortages ensue, and prices rise. This classic case of too much money chasing too few goods is a fundamental driver of inflation in many economies. Cost-push inflation, on the other hand, arises from increases in the cost of production. When the prices of key inputs, such as labor, raw materials, and energy, rise, producers often pass these costs onto consumers in the form of higher prices. One of the most prominent examples of cost-push inflation is the oil crises of the 1970s, when sharp increases in oil prices led to widespread inflation across the globe. Since oil is a critical input for transportation, manufacturing, and heating, its price surge rippled through virtually every sector, raising the overall cost of goods and services. Similarly, increases in wages, especially if not matched by corresponding gains in productivity, can prompt businesses to raise their prices to maintain profit margins. Supply chain disruptions, whether due to natural disasters, geopolitical tensions, or pandemics, can also constrain the availability of goods, leading to higher production costs and, ultimately, inflation. Monetary policy plays a pivotal role in influencing inflation. Central banks, such as the Federal Reserve in the United States or the European Central Bank in the Eurozone, control the money supply and interest rates to achieve macroeconomic stability. When central banks adopt an expansionary monetary policy, lowering interest rates and increasing the money supply, they make borrowing cheaper and encourage spending and investment. While such policies can stimulate economic growth, they can also stoke inflation if the increase in money supply outpaces economic output. The quantity theory of money, encapsulated in the equation mv equals pq, where m is money supply, v is velocity of money, p is price level, and q is real output, suggests that if the money supply grows faster than real output, inflation will result. Conversely, contractionary monetary policies, raising interest rates and reducing money supply, are used to rein in inflation, but can risk stifling economic growth. Fiscal policy, the government's approach to taxation and public spending, also affects inflation. When governments increase spending or cut taxes without corresponding increases in revenue, budget deficits can ensue. To finance these deficits, governments may borrow from the public or, in some cases, from the central bank. If the central bank monetizes the deficit by printing new money, it injects additional liquidity into the economy, potentially leading to inflation. Large-scale fiscal stimulus packages, particularly those implemented during economic crises, can thus have inflationary consequences if not carefully calibrated. However, the relationship between fiscal policy and inflation is nuanced. During recessions, increased government spending can help offset declines in private demand without necessarily triggering immediate inflation, especially if there is significant slack in the economy. Expectations about future inflation can themselves become self-fulfilling prophecies. When businesses and consumers anticipate higher prices, they may adjust their behavior in ways that actually contribute to inflation. For instance, workers may demand higher wages to keep up with expected increases in the cost of living, and businesses, in turn, may raise prices to cover these higher labor costs. This wage price spiral can perpetuate inflation even in the absence of underlying economic imbalances. Central banks closely monitor inflation expectations and often communicate their commitment to price stability to anchor these expectations and prevent runaway inflation. External shocks and global factors are increasingly important in today's interconnected world. International commodity prices, exchange rates, and global supply chains all influence domestic inflation. For countries that rely heavily on imports, a depreciation of the national currency can make imported goods more expensive, contributing to inflation. Similarly, fluctuations in the prices of globally traded commodities, such as oil, food, and metals, can have direct and indirect effects on domestic price levels. Geopolitical events, such as wars or trade disputes, can disrupt supply chains and create bottlenecks, leading to shortages and price hikes. The COVID-19 pandemic, for example, exposed vulnerabilities in global supply chains, leading to delays, increased shipping costs, and shortages of key products, all of which contributed to inflationary pressures in many countries. Structural factors within an economy can also influence inflation dynamics. These include demographic trends, technological advancements, market competition, and regulatory frameworks. For instance, aging populations in advanced economies can reduce the labor force, potentially leading to higher wages and inflation if productivity does not keep pace. On the other hand, technological innovations that boost productivity and lower production costs can exert downward pressure on prices, counteracting inflation. The degree of competition in markets also matters. In highly competitive industries, firms may be less able to pass on cost increases to consumers, limiting inflation. Regulatory policies, such as price controls or subsidies, can temporarily suppress inflation but may lead to distortions and unintended consequences in the long run. Another dimension to consider is the role of supply chain management and logistics. In modern economies, goods often travel thousands of miles and pass through multiple stages before reaching consumers. Any disruption along this chain, whether due to natural disasters, labor strikes, port congestion, or geopolitical tensions, can delay deliveries, reduce supply, and push up prices. The pandemic-induced shortages of semiconductors, for example, had cascading effects on industries ranging from automobiles to electronics, leading to price increases for end consumers. As supply chains become more global and complex, economies are increasingly susceptible to such disruptions, making supply-side inflation a persistent risk. Inflation can also be influenced by psychological and behavioral factors. Consumer sentiment, herd behavior, and media coverage can amplify inflationary trends. If consumers believe that prices will continue to rise, they may accelerate purchases, further increasing demand and pushing prices higher. This feedback loop can make it challenging for policymakers to break the cycle of rising prices. Moreover, inflation does not affect all segments of the population equally. Those on fixed incomes or with limited bargaining power may struggle to keep up with rising costs, exacerbating inequality and social tensions. In emerging and developing economies, inflation dynamics can be even more volatile due to structural weaknesses, reliance on commodity exports, and less credible monetary institutions. Currency depreciation, capital flight, and political instability can all contribute to rapid and unpredictable price increases. Hyperinflation, an extreme and accelerating form of inflation, has plagued countries like Zimbabwe and Venezuela, where the collapse of monetary discipline and loss of confidence in the currency rendered money virtually worthless. While such episodes are rare, they underscore the importance of sound macroeconomic management and institutional credibility in maintaining price stability. The interaction between inflation and unemployment is another area of interest for economists. The Phillips curve, a concept developed in the mid-20th century, posits an inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment. As unemployment falls, inflation tends to rise, and vice versa. The logic is that tight labor markets drive up wages, which in turn fuel higher prices. However, the relationship is not always stable, and periods of stagflation, when high inflation and high unemployment occur simultaneously, pose significant challenges for policymakers. The experience of the 1970s, when oil shocks led to both rising prices and joblessness, demonstrated that inflation can coexist with weak economic growth, complicating the task of economic management. Globalization has had a profound impact on inflation dynamics over the past several decades. The integration of emerging economies into the global trading system, particularly China and India, has expanded the supply of labor and goods, exerting downward pressure on prices in advanced economies. Access to cheaper imported goods and offshoring of production have helped keep inflation low, even as domestic demand has grown. However, globalization also introduces new vulnerabilities. Disruptions in one part of the world can quickly transmit inflationary pressures across borders. Trade tensions, protectionist policies, and efforts to reshore production in response to geopolitical risks could reverse some of the disinflationary benefits of globalization, leading to higher and more volatile inflation in the future. Technological change is a double-edged sword in the context of inflation. On one hand, advances in automation, digitalization, and productivity can lower production costs and increase efficiency, helping to contain inflation. The proliferation of e-commerce, for instance, has increased price transparency and competition, making it harder for firms to raise prices without losing customers. On the other hand, rapid technological shifts can render certain skills obsolete, leading to structural unemployment and wage pressures in affected sectors. Furthermore, the transition to green technologies and efforts to combat climate change may entail significant upfront costs, which could be passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices, at least in the short term. The role of financial markets and asset prices in inflation is another area of growing interest. While traditional measures of inflation focus on consumer prices, asset price inflation, rising prices of stocks, real estate, and other investments can have significant economic consequences. Loose monetary policies and low interest rates can fuel speculative bubbles in asset markets, creating wealth effects that spill over into consumption and demand for goods and services. When these bubbles burst, they can trigger financial crises and deflationary pressures, as seen during the global financial crisis of 2008. Thus, the relationship between monetary policy, asset prices, and consumer price inflation is complex and requires careful monitoring. Inflation is also influenced by the distribution of income and wealth within society. When income gains are concentrated among the wealthy, who tend to save more and spend less as a proportion of their income, the impact on aggregate demand and inflation may be muted. Conversely, when lower and middle-income households who have a higher propensity to consume see their incomes rise, demand for goods and services can increase more rapidly, potentially fueling inflation. Policies aimed at reducing inequality, such as minimum wage increases or expanded social safety nets, can thus have inflationary effects if they significantly boost demand without corresponding increases in supply. The measurement of inflation itself presents challenges, as official statistics may not fully capture the lived experience of households. Changes in consumption patterns, quality improvements, and the introduction of new products can complicate the task of tracking price changes over time. For example, technological products often become more powerful and feature-rich, even as their prices remain stable or decline, leading to adjustments in inflation indices that may understate true cost of living increases. Housing costs, which represent a significant portion of household budgets, are often measured differently across countries, affecting comparability and perceptions of inflation. The consequences of inflation extend beyond the economic sphere, influencing social and political dynamics. Persistent or high inflation can erode trust in institutions, fuel populist movements, and destabilize governments. In extreme cases, hyperinflation can lead to the breakdown of social order, as seen in historical episodes such as Weimar Germany or, more recently, in Venezuela. Even moderate inflation, if not accompanied by commensurate wage growth, can undermine living standards and exacerbate social tensions. Policymakers must therefore balance the need for economic growth with the imperative of maintaining price stability, recognizing that the causes of inflation are varied and context-dependent. In recent years, the debate over the causes of inflation has been reignited by a series of global shocks. The COVID-19 pandemic disrupted supply chains, shifted consumption patterns, and prompted unprecedented fiscal and monetary stimulus. As economies reopened, pent-up demand collided with constrained supply, leading to surges in prices for everything from cars to housing to groceries. At the same time, geopolitical tensions, such as the war in Ukraine, have driven up energy and food prices, further adding to inflationary pressures. These developments have challenged conventional wisdom and sparked debates over the appropriate policy responses to inflation in a rapidly changing world. Looking ahead, several factors are likely to shape the trajectory of inflation in the coming years. Demographic shifts, such as aging populations in advanced economies and youthful populations in developing countries, will influence labor markets and demand patterns. The ongoing transition to renewable energy and efforts to address climate change may entail higher costs for certain goods and services, at least during the adjustment period. Technological advancements will continue to reshape production processes and consumer behavior, with uncertain implications for inflation. The evolution of globalization, shaped by geopolitical rivalries, and efforts to build more resilient supply chains, will also play a critical role in determining inflation dynamics. Central banks and policymakers face the daunting task of navigating these cross-currents while maintaining price stability and supporting economic growth. Effective communication, credible policy frameworks, and a willingness to adapt to changing circumstances will be essential in managing inflation risks. At the same time, greater coordination between monetary, fiscal, and structural policies can help address the root causes of inflation and promote inclusive, sustainable growth. For individuals and businesses, understanding the causes of inflation is vital for making informed decisions about spending, saving, and investment. While inflation is often seen as an abstract economic concept, its effects are felt in everyday life, from the price of groceries and gasoline to the cost of housing and healthcare. By staying informed about the factors driving inflation and the potential policy responses, households and firms can better prepare for and adapt to changing economic conditions. In conclusion, inflation is a multifaceted phenomenon shaped by a wide array of forces, including demand and supply dynamics, monetary and fiscal policies, expectations, global shocks, structural changes, and behavioral factors. The recent resurgence of inflation in many parts of the world underscores the importance of understanding these underlying drivers and the need for agile, coordinated policy responses. As the global economy continues to evolve, the challenge of managing inflation will remain a central concern for policymakers, businesses, and households alike. By appreciating the complexity of inflation's causes, societies can better navigate the uncertainties of the economic landscape and work towards a future of stable and inclusive prosperity.